So as Steve mentioned, I'm with NRMCA. I'm part of our codes and standards team, and my background is in fire protection engineering. So I deal with fire codes and standards. And some of my team members, you may have seen them here at convention, they handle sustainability codes advocacy, energy codes advocacy, and structural codes advocacy. So my topic is in the model codes, proposals for the 2027 I-codes. And so I will go over a quick review of the ICC and NFPA code development processes. I'll talk a little bit about what's the motivation for making changes to the codes. And then I will go through a few of our code change proposals that are under consideration for the 2027 code cycles. I can't go through all of them in half an hour, but I will go through a sampling of them for you to get a flavor of what these changes look like and what motivates them. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about how you can get involved in codes and standards advocacy. So these are two graphic charts that talk about the ICC and NFPA code development processes. I know they're very small on screen. They're actually, you can get to them online. For the ICC process on the left, if you go to iccsafe.org, you can pull this up, or you can just Google ICC development process, and that's one of the first links that comes up. And on the right-hand side, that's the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association standard development process, which you can get to from nfpa.org or also Googling NFPA code development process. So I'll briefly run through this. It is complex, but when you go through it, it becomes a little bit easier to understand. So I'll do my best to explain it. So basically, the ICC process starts with proposing a code change. So you submit a code change. Again, ICC is on a 3-year code cycle. So in the first year of the cycle, in January, the proposals are usually due early January. And then all of the code proposals are gathered and they're published in a monograph. And that monograph is published online in about March. Early March. And then there is, so that's the publishing. Then there's a first round of committee action hearings. So if you're familiar with this process, you know that the process is code change proposal submitted, first round, a committee action hearing, and then public comment hearing. The process was recently changed. So now you have 2 rounds of committee action hearings. So you have a first round, you have a report published, and then you have an opportunity to submit comments based on what happened in the first round, and that becomes the basis for a second round of committee action hearings. So you're submitting a proposal, you're going to a committee action hearing, pleading your case to a committee. If it doesn't go as you expected, you can go again at the second round of committee action hearings and plead your case to the committee again. So the committee can hear a proposal up to 2 times, and then you move to a public comment period. So you can submit a comment on your proposal as a public comment, and then you plead your case not to the committee, but at the public comment hearings, you plead your case to a room full of code officials, and they vote on your code proposal. Now, if you go through those 3 in this new process and you're not successful, sorry, try again in 3 years in the next round. But if you are successful, then your code proposal goes to an online governmental consensus vote. And as long as that vote upholds the previous decisions, either in the committee action hearing or the public comment period, then your code change becomes published in the new edition. Now, if you are successful in the committee action hearing and nobody puts in a comment at either of these stages, you go to the consent agenda and you don't have to go all around the circle. It immediately becomes published. But that's if you did a fantastic job on your code proposal and nobody comments on it. This process is very much open to the public. It differs a little bit from the NFPA standards development process, which which is open to the public but does not have the same nature of hearings. So the hearings are not a public hearing. You submit a proposal during a public input stage, and then your proposal is heard at a committee meeting. So a bit of a smaller scale review, but the committee really has a lot of power. A motion can only be made by a committee member, and your proposal can only be accepted by the committee. And the committee also has full flexibility to take your proposal and change it around as much as they would like. So the NFPA process, also a couple stages. You have a public input stage and a public comment stage. So you put in a proposal at public input stage. It's put in a first draft agenda. You have a first draft meeting with the committee. If they accept your comment, it goes into the report of the first draft. And based on the comments that are proposed in the proposals in the first draft stage, you can comment on them in the public comment stage. If there is a part of the code that you didn't comment on public input stage, you cannot comment on it on the public comment stage. So it's important to be aware of the schedule so that you don't miss a deadline. I mentioned ICC is a 3-year process. Depending on which code or standard, NFPA is either a 3 or 4-year cycle. So if you miss it, you could have to wait as much as 4 years to go in and put that in again as an idea. So you go through public input stage and public comment stage. After the committee reviews comments to the public inputs in round 2 based on their decisions, a second draft report is published, and then the next stage is a little bit different than ICC. So after the second draft meeting, they publish the second draft, and there's a public comment period. So in that public comment period, you can raise public comments, and they are heard in this process that's called NITMAM. I know it's hard to see. That's the notice of intent to make a motion. So the final process in NFPA is the NFPA technical meeting, which happens every year in June, and all of the codes for that cycle are raised. If there are motions that were made as part of the NITMAM period, then that code or standard is discussed at this technical meeting, and all the NFPA members in the room vote on that motion. If there's no motions made, that code or standard goes to consent agenda. And so after this technical meeting, based on the actions, it goes to the Standards Council. There's also, in both, it's not shown here, but in both processes, you can make an appeal. And so in the NFPA process, after the technical meeting, there's an appeals process, and after the appeals process is followed, the codes are published. So that was a little bit lengthy, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of understanding of the complexity of these code development processes. So that's a pretty complex process. What would motivate you to put in a code change? Lots of reasons, right? So Dave talked about ACI standards and how they're updated regularly. Well, you want to go back and make sure that in the model codes, those references are updated and the provisions are also updated from the new edition. So one motivation is to update reference codes and standards, also to pick up revisions that were made in those codes and standards and make sure you have alignment in the model building codes. Another big reason that code changes are proposed, and Dave touched on this a little bit, is based on issues that are raised by industry related to design, constructability, and other issues. And so that is a big reason why many entities put in code change proposals based on issues that they're having in the field. Another type of change, sometimes you'll see changes that are not very technical, but they're really reorganizing or reordering a section or a chapter of the code for clarity. So as an example, in the International Fire Code, there was a big reorganization in the 2021 cycle to reorder the fire safety under construction chapter to make it easier to understand and enforceable. And then finally, this isn't necessarily the mission of ACI, but for many of us in industry, we want to propose code changes to either maintain or increase our market share, right? So we want to maintain or increase the number of yards of concrete that are pouring, and we want to work to make sure the codes are favorable to concrete construction, or at least fair or neutral compared to other materials. So the next few slides, these are very small, I apologize, but this is all available online. If you're interested in a particular proposal or you want to know how to get to them, you can see me afterwards, and I can easily either share these with you or share with you how you can access them for this code cycle and future code cycles. But I'll go through some examples of each of these code proposals, again, for you to get a flavor. So I mentioned that one motivation was to update reference codes and standards. So this is a proposal to, let me see here. This is a proposal to reference in ACI 216. Okay, so this is a proposal that's being put into Chapter 7 of the IBC, and you can see here we've added, there's a section 721 that talks about fire resistance rated building elements, right? And it says follow these tables in Chapter 7 of the code. We are adding in here the prescriptive details of fire resistance rated concrete building components shall comply with, yes, this above, but also Section 721 of ACI 216.1 or PCI 124. Those are standards dealing with fire resistance of concrete. Another example of updating to reference codes and standards. So Dave talked about ACI 44011 in the IBC. It was, I think you mentioned 2021 or 2024 code cycle. We have put in a proposal for the 2024, the 2027 cycle of NFPA 5000. So many people are familiar with the IBC. It's the International Building Code. NFPA also has a building safety and construction code, not adopted in the United States, but adopted internationally in the Middle East and in other regions of the world. And so we wanted also to make sure that ACI 44011 was referenced in NFPA 5000 in Chapter 41, which is the chapter on concrete. And so you can see the proposal here that now pulls in provisions for structural concrete with GFRP reinforcement. Previously, 5000 only talked generally about reinforcement, so we wanted to make a distinction between steel reinforcement and GFRP reinforcement. This is an example of revisions based on updates to other standards, not ACI standards. PCA 100, which is a prescriptive design guide for 1- and 2-family dwellings. It's actually a standard. Maintenance of that standard was assumed by NRMCA. So we have proposals in for NFPA to update that reference from PCA 100 to NRMCA 100. And in the Group B cycle for the International Building Codes, so the codes are actually, for the IBC, they're divided into a Group A and a Group B. Group A is mainly, and that's to divide it so it's easier to deal with. Group A is usually heard in the first year of the code cycle, and Group B is the second year. As part of Group B, this falls into structural, and this will be a proposal to update that reference moving forward. All right, so this is the more exciting proposals, revisions based on issues raised by industry. So Steve and I were approached a couple of years ago now by the structural design community, some structural engineers. They were running into challenges when they were designing for fire resistance. So as you know, concrete structural members are required to either contain a certain amount of cover or thickness. to meet requirements for fire resistance ratings of structural elements in buildings. So the IBC in the 2024, the current edition, requires you to assume that all structural members are considered unrestrained, right? And so whether a member is restrained or unrestrained, if you go to the tables in 216 or Chapter 7, ASTM E119, that's a standard for fire resistance testing. Based on whether you're considered restrained or unrestrained in your design condition will impact how much cover you need to provide. And so if you're designing to ACI 318, however, ACI 318 only deals with restrained conditions. And restrained conditions allow you to have not as much fire cover. You don't have to have as much cover if you're restrained as opposed to unrestrained, because in a fire condition, your member will not be subject to the same movement during a thermal event. So the members were complaining, the structural engineers were complaining that their AHJs were not accepting that their design conditions were restrained, even though they were designing to ACI 318, which says you're only designing to restrained conditions. So this was an involved code change. First, we had to go to ASTM E119. There's a table. Again, this is the standard for testing for fire resistance. There's a table X31, which has a guide for determining whether your structural members are restrained or unrestrained. And we went to this concrete framing section, and we noticed that some of the language was a bit out of date. It wasn't consistent with the way people actually build today, right? Or design today. So it had language like beams are fastened, or, let's see what else. Where the floor or roof construction is cast with the framing members. We wanted to do an update to kind of make this more general, more consistent. So we added in, instead of fastened, we just said pinned or fixed connections. Again, we're using terminology that's consistent with ACI 318, right? So ACI 318 says that members that are not anchored, connected, or pinned, they're considered simply supported, and those are really considered unrestrained conditions. So we made clarifications to this table to make it consistent with that 318 terminology. Not a real technical change, but a real clarification of conditions. So we added in this line here, beams or cast in place concrete slabs with simply supported connections. Those are now clearly unrestrained. And we clarify all of these other conditions that are noted with fixed pinned connections. Those are restrained. So after this change was made, we could then go back to the I-codes process and put in a proposal. So as I mentioned, the IBC says fire resistance rated assemblies tested under E119 or UL 263 shall be considered to be restrained unless satisfactory. They have to be considered to be restrained unless evidence satisfactory to the building official is furnished. We put in this exception that says, unless the AHJ says otherwise, if you are in accordance with ACI 318, then you're considered restrained. So this combination of proposed changes, this one is actually already done, published as of June 2024. This has been submitted and heard and approved at 2 committee action hearings. This combination will hopefully satisfy the concerns of the structural design community. Another issue is related to energy codes and thermal bridging, right? So we have an ACI standard, ACI 122. We have 122.1 here. I think this is 122.2 and 122.3. 122.3 is the first one here that I have shown. That's thermal properties of concrete and masonry for use in determining energy code compliance, except for low-rise residential buildings. So this is in NFPA 5000, Chapter 51, which is on energy. And this is a proposal to reference in 122.3 as an option for commercial buildings. And then this middle one is for thermal bridging. So it's offering 122.1 thermal bridge mitigation for buildings having concrete and masonry walls and masonry veneer, referencing that in as a way to mitigate thermal bridges. And then we have, and that is for also for for commercial buildings. And then we have this one for low-rise residential buildings, which is referencing in, I have very poor vision, so I have to get in close. That's referencing in ACI 122.2. So these are all proposed as part of the current code cycle for NFPA 5000, again, the Building Safety and Construction Code. We've gone through one stage. We have to do another crack at it in the second draft, which we'll be working on over the next year. And then on the I-code side, this is actually needs to be proposed as part of the IECC process, which is the International Energy Conservation Code, which that is now a standard. It is not, even though it's called a code, it goes through the standards process, and that will be opening up very soon for submission of code proposals. All right, I think this might be one of the last ones. So the examples I gave before, this restrained versus unrestrained, this was really a design issue. The ACI 122 standards are really about making it easier to construct buildings and mitigate thermal bridging issues and make it easier to enforce so that we are actually able to realize energy savings. This next proposal is about material testing, okay? So there were some changes, not changes, but clarifications made in the I-codes that indicated that materials that are required to be considered non-combustible in the code, they must be tested in accordance with ASTM E136. Well, if you're in the concrete industry, you know that we have decades and decades of research and testing to demonstrate that concrete is non-combustible. So in industry, the idea that we need to test every concrete mix or project for design seems a bit ridiculous, right? And it is even a little bit silly considering for many, many years in the NFPA commentary, yes, building construction has to be, considered non-combustible through ASTM E136 testing, but there's some commentary that says inherently non-combustible materials do not have to be tested to be classified as non-combustible materials. And examples of such materials include steel, concrete, masonry, and glass. So there was a feeling among the concrete industry that we wanted to codify this commentary from NFPA into the International Building Code. And so right after this section that requires ASTM E136, which is a vertical tube test for combustibility, there's now exceptions granted. The following proposed. The following building materials shall not be required to be tested to be acceptable as non-combustible building materials. That's steel, concrete, masonry, glass, and certain aluminum alloys. Now, we put in a similar proposal in the first round, but there was a lot of opposition because there's people that aren't quite familiar with how concrete works, and they were very worried that we're putting magic materials in the concrete that are somehow going to make it combustible. And we originally had steel and concrete. Oops, we forgot to include masonry. We didn't include glass, and we didn't include steel. So in the first round, we went to the hearings. We got quite a bit of comments and I would say opposition. And so the Fire Code Action Committee, which is a code committee within the ICC group that works on proposals in the cycles, got us all together, all of the stakeholders, and this is the language that we agreed on, really an example of the consensus process. And so to satisfy some of those concerns, we've added containing no combustible aggregates or fibers into the concrete and masonry. This language, because all of the stakeholders came to the table, not highly contested, and this language was approved as part of the second committee action hearing. We may likely come back with a public comment to see if we can revise this language to be a little bit more accurate, because there are some fibers that are added, there are admixtures that are added. We may have to live with this language for a few years until we're able to develop maybe a standard or a guide that really defines, for people not familiar with concrete, a combustibility standard for concrete as an example. So this is an example of a testing issue that was raised by industry. And I think that was my last example. How can you get involved in this process? If you see an issue that you're facing in design, construction, testing, that can be addressed in codes and standards, share those. Share those with engineers that you know are engaged in code advocacy. You can also submit your own proposals or public input items. It's a completely transparent, well, I won't say completely. It's a relatively transparent and open process, open to the public from all over the world. So you have the power to submit a code change proposal. To get a better flavor of how this works, I recommend that people actually go to committee meetings and hearings. Then you'll really get an idea of how the process works. And you can also, in many cases, watch that process online. So the iCodes process, there's a live webcast of every hearing. You can get to it online. You don't even have to register to do that. And for the NFPA process, the meetings, they're published in areas of the website, but you can also attend as a guest in those for any issues that you're interested in. And then finally, I would say, encourage if you belong to a trade association or you belong to a state or chapter association, check to see if they're involved in, Steve mentioned the Alliance for Concrete Codes and Standards. That is really a forum where you can connect with other code advocacy engineers and really work as an alliance through this process. So I hope I was able to give you a flavor of what code changes look like, what motivates them, and how you can get involved. Thank you.